So I'm going to kick off. So I did not know that you have already found mechanisms by which air pollution can increase the risk of lung cancer. It seems kind of intuitive that it might do, but I hadn't realized that you'd got so far in identifying some of those mechanisms. And I think that's really kind of quite exciting.
Thank you. It's sweet of you. Yeah, we're excited. We've got a long way to go. I mean, I think we know now what, one of the major vulnerable cell types is in the lung to this process. What we now want to try and work out, I sort of briefly alluded to it in my talk, this drug canakinumab prevents lung cancer, but it has no activity on established lung cancer, which is a super interesting biological problem, because what it tells you is that the target of the antibody, IL-1 beta, is required for tumour initiation, but it's not required to maintain the tumour once it's established. So there is a hit-and-run mechanism, which are quite unusual in biology. So trying to understand what that hit-and-run mechanism is, the vulnerable cell, how air pollution affects it, and how the mutation in that vulnerable cell collaborates with air pollution around some inflammatory network that may be in part IL-1 beta driven, that acts for a very short time period on that cell, that then triggers its invasive progression into a cancer where it becomes independent of IL-1 beta, for me is the multi-million-dollar question now. We have to understand that problem.
And do you think that air pollution, the insult has to be the same, or it doesn't really matter what the insult is? It's just a final kind of common mechanism and pathway? Or do you think different types of air pollution may activate different cellular mechanisms?
Yeah, I don't think we know the answer to that. I think in part that there are a few things going on. The particle size is important. The smaller particles get into the bottom of the lung more easily. They don't get trapped by the cilia. The cilia, what they call it, the mucociliary escalator. Right. So the small PM2.5s, the very small micron particulates get deep into the lung, and their insoluble nature. I think there is something I mentioned about the sort of physicochemical properties of these pollutants get taken up presumably by phagocytosis by the macrophage, and the macrophage can't then digest them, and partly because of the LPS coating, we think, but also partly because of the physical shape of the particles. We think they puncture membranes, which ultimately together results in the release of interleukin-1 beta. To your point, whether other environmental insults will work through the same axis, I just don't know. I just don't know at the moment. And then there's a whole idea around ingesting these particulates, which we do, because we obviously, the mucociliary escalator sweeps them up into the back of the oropharynx, and we swallow them, and they get into the gut and into our gastrointestinal systems. And we know very little about the consequences of air pollutants and microplastics on the gut, for example. So these are all things we want to study. Difficulty is, I'm sure you have this problem in your line of work. One mouse experiment takes a whole postdoc 4 years, and there's a sort of a limit to what you can study at any one time. So we are quite cautious about trying to take on too much.
And how much is absorbed into the circulation?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. One thing we are doing is working with Sonia Gandhi, who's somebody who works, a neuroscientist. You probably know her. She's a physician scientist. She's got a joint appointment with Queen Square Institute of Neurology, Hospital of Neurology and Neurosurgery, and the Crick. And we've got a joint project looking at the impact of air pollutants on neurodegenerative disease and Parkinson's. So it turns out these air pollutants get into the olfactory bulb, into the brain. They get taken up by microglia, which is sort of the brain macrophage, as you know, and they generate the same inflammatory mediators that we see in the lung. And they're evidently, Sonia and others have got some very nice data that shows that there's a prodromal phase of neurodegenerative disease where there is a hyperinflammatory syndrome that possibly triggers the accumulation of these insoluble neurofibrillary tangles, and we're wondering whether, to some extent or another, air pollutants may exacerbate that inflammatory
that's very
network.
Interesting. It's not a million miles away from my work, actually, because we're also looking at hypothalamic inflammation.
Oh, are you?
Okay, and its potential role in obesity, because initially we're thinking about from diet, so whether a high-fat diet, which certainly in rodents promotes inflammation within the hypothalamus, and which actively then, again, through microglia, as you said, and you can quantify different aspects of that inflammation, that then can impair leptin signaling and induce a degree
Really?
of leptin resistance,
Really?
which in itself will then drive weight gain.
Wow.
What I was kind of assuming that the major trigger for that is from the diet and thinking about the nutritional content of the diet.
Yeah.
What I hadn't thought about is whether air pollutants or I had thought other chemicals might do the same thing.
Has anybody looked to see if air pollution levels, if there is any epidemiological association between air pollution levels and body mass index?
I think there is actually.
Is there?
Yeah, but I'll need to kind of revisit that data. People have tended to think about it's complex because often
Confounded
people
by
with
lifestyle
obesity,
and
socioeconomic deprivation.
Yeah.
So there's a strong association between socioeconomic deprivation and obesity.
Yeah.
So with twice as high prevalence in children and adults
Yeah.
living in poorer areas,
Yeah.
and those areas
course.
often are areas with high
Yeah.
levels of pollution, it's often been thought to be that people therefore have less money and therefore the diet they're consuming is poorer. But of course, there may be multiple factors.
Yeah, this is the problem with epidemiology,
yes,
isn't it?
yeah.
Very interesting. Maybe I could ask you a quick question, which is, you alluded to this in your talk, where you're looking at sort of opposite phenotypes, patients with very high BMIs versus those with very low BMIs. And this is something that we've been thinking a bit about in lung cancer. To what extent is it helpful to look at these polar opposite clinical phenotypes? I think it's extremely important.
Yeah.
My question to you is, what are you going to find, do you think? Do you think you're going to find, in the one case, let's say you've got inactivation of a receptor in the high BMI individuals and gain of function in the low, or do you think you will find new pathways in the polar opposite clinical syndromes, if you can call them that, because they're not obviously, but in the very thin individuals, will you find whole new appetite pathways that suppress appetite that you wouldn't have expected to find from studying the high BMI patients?
Yeah. So I think it's a bit of both. So there are certainly some examples, and the melanocortin-4 receptor is a key one, where loss of function causes obesity and gain of function mutations in the same gene doesn't really cause thinness, it protects against obesity.
Right.
So people are just almost like mildly overweight, but they don't develop obesity if they have this gain of function variant. So what we don't find is, for many other molecules, gain of function variant. So I think there are additional different genes which are promoting thinness.
Very interesting.
Some of those may well be appetite genes, but I think some of them are going to be genes that affect potentially energy expenditure or how you use your fat.
Right.
Are you better at utilizing fat?
Yeah.
And is that allows you to stay thin?
So that is a super cool question, because when I spoke to Steve O'Reilly about that issue, his view is that body mass accumulation, and forgive me, Steve, if he's listening to this, and I've misinterpreted the answer, but my question was, are some humans just less efficient at using energy than others? And there are some individuals that are very efficient at using energy, which means they can eat anything they want and they'll just burn it off.
Yeah.
To extend Steve's analogy, the bath just empties faster. The bath full of water just empties faster.
Yeah.
So you have to keep filling it up.
Yeah.
So there are individuals who can eat a lot more but never gain weight for that reason.
Yeah. So it's likely, yes, because we certainly have recruited those individuals. What we don't know yet is what are those mechanisms.
Yeah.
And that's what we're hoping to find out now in the next kind of phase of our work. But already, even for a few of the genes that we have found by studying people with obesity, they do have a lower metabolic rate, but it's not the explanation for most people with obesity.
Right. Yes.
But I think that's different from how you utilize fat.
Right.
And I think that's what we're probably going to be looking for.
Okay, interesting. And so, the other aspect I was interested in is that you've got these, all these amazing mouse models, and what you're beginning to see now are these really extraordinary behavioural differences that link with genotypes that are linked to obesity or body mass, essentially, in one way or another. Evolutionarily speaking, why is it, do you think, that these receptors, these signalling pathways, are functioning to, for instance, allow a mouse to nurse its young better at the same time as regulating body mass? What is the sort of benefit from that? I mean, is it obvious? Is it really as simple as, oh well, the mother needs to be healthy and fit and have enough body mass to be able to feed the young? Yeah. That's why it's so.
I think these are all instinctive behaviours that, to a certain extent, are hardwired, developmentally hardwired in the brain because they're fundamental for survival.
Yeah.
And so we've often thought about maternal care, social interaction, the flight response. as all being kind of highly conserved innate behaviors that are fundamental. Clearly eating is also one of them.
Yeah.
And so that's why essentially they're all coupled together, because clearly you have to be able to socially interact to eat food, get your food, share your food. You're aggressive because you have to protect your food, protect your young,
Right.
protect
Yes.
your territory.
Yes.
Anxiety in terms of the threat from predators to yourself and to your food and to your offspring.
Makes perfect sense.
So it's
yeah.
all kind of
Yeah.
intricately linked in with survival. And
Absolutely
almost
amazing.
fundamental to all of those behaviors is eating.
Yeah.
And so essentially by discovering some of the genes and the pathways that regulate eating behavior, we've inadvertently discovered the pathways that regulate that entire network.
Incredible. So talk me through your views on GLP-1 agonists. I mean, I've got quite a lot of friends now who were, accumulating a fair amount of weight during their time post-medical school through to becoming independent consultants who put on a fair amount of weight, who are now taking GLP-1 agonists. And going out for meals with them is not exactly the most enjoyable exercise any longer. You're talking about the social interactions of eating.
Yeah.
You know, they will leave, half a steak,
Right.
won't have a starter.
Right.
There are articles in the paper about people fussing over the bill because they don't want to split the bill 50-50
Right.
because they've hardly had anything to eat. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at in a funny sort of way is there such a thing as a free lunch? Can these drugs really be that good? Are you worried about the long-term consequences of GLP-1 agonists that we haven't yet truly bottomed out?
So there are quite a few questions in there. So I think that there's no doubt this is a revolution in the pharmacotherapy of obesity.
Yeah.
These drugs in general, in people in whom they work, are highly effective, and they will suppress appetite and they will help people to lose weight. And I think as a physician who I look after a lot of patients with obesity, particularly severe obesity, that's incredibly helpful. We've not had anything to help people like that.
Yeah.
And actually we know already from the trials, even after a few years, they're reducing people's risk of cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, etc. So they're hugely beneficial medically. Now they do often affect the rewarding properties of food, how much you like food. And it's interesting, there are knock-on effects potentially on things like other addictive types of behavior. People are smoking less, people are drinking less, people are gambling less.
It's amazing.
Which is incredible. So huge benefits to health. What is the long-term consequence? That we don't know. There clearly are some side effects, and some people can't tolerate these drugs. 10, sometimes 20% of the people that we give them to may not be able to tolerate them. But for people who can tolerate them, then of course we've got to think about the long-term consequences, like with any drug. There are some concerns about muscle function and muscle loss. And
I'm worried about chronic pancreas inflammation and the possible consequences on long-term risk of pancreas cancer. Is that something I should be worried about?
I mean, no evidence for that at the moment, but I mean, clearly, again, one has to be thinking about these things. If we're sort of with it, like with any drug.
No evidence for cancer, but there is evidence for pancreas inflammation.
There is evidence for pancreatic inflammation,
and that is a concern. I would have thought in the long term, given it can take 20 years for a cancer to evolve.
And I think that's going to be the challenge. Is that at the moment, certainly in the UK, these medications are licensed just for 2 years. But we know if we take somebody off the medication, they're going to regain the weight.
Yes.
That's exactly what happens in a homeostatic system. Now it's likely we're going to need other interventions to help people to maintain the weight loss that they've achieved. And that's probably a more effective solution than long-term therapy with these drugs.
And do you ever think about why evolution has wired the GLP-1 receptor this way? Given the enormous health benefits of agonizing it, why haven't we seen SNPs derive and be selected for in the population that partially agonize the receptor, that allow all these health benefits to manifest without having Wegovy? Is it just simply because this sort of this era of food being plentiful is relatively recent in human evolution?
So certainly food being plentiful is a relatively recent evolution. The GLP-1 drugs act on the same system that I was talking about in my talk, the sort of melanocortin pathways, the hypothalamic and brainstem circuits that regulate appetite and weight. Usually it's much more of a short-term satiety signal in relation to meals. So you're effectively hijacking the system using these drugs. So it's interesting, there isn't really strong genetic evidence for variation in the GLP-1 system, but there is in the rest of the hypothalamic system.
Right, okay, that makes sense.
So they're basically inputting into the same pathway.
There's so many questions from your talk. I've got one last one, which is the I wanted to ask you, which is the sort of genetics of, around the genetics of human behaviour, but particularly, dare I say it, and if I'm allowed to ask this question, criminal behaviour.
Right.
And you were alluding to some of the, the
Sure.
rather recalcitrant behaviours of
Yeah.
some of your mouse models.
Yeah.
And
the people, actually.
And the people associated.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And well, where does that leave us? Because I mean, there's been this long debate in society
Sure.
about criminal behaviour and underlying
Sure.
genetic basis for it.
Yeah.
But in this case, where you've got a clear
cut, the evidence was very clear.
Monogenic
Yeah, absolutely.
driver of
Yeah.
criminal behaviour.
Yeah.
Does that and should that change the way we think about the
Well,
prison system and considering criminal behaviour like a complex trait, like anything else?
Sure. Well, I think, for those who study aggressive behavior in animal models, for example, they know full well that the evidence is incredibly strong for the heritability of aggressive behavior.
It really.
And even children who are adopted, they have the risk of aggressive behavior of their biological parents
right? Yeah.
rather than the adoptive parents who
Very
don't have
interesting.
criminal behavior. So the
Wow.
genetic evidence for the heritability of aggression is actually quite strong.
Gosh.
Now, people have almost like not wanted to kind of
Discuss
that. There are a couple of genes that have been shown in the past to cause a sort of recessively inherited aggression type of syndrome. One is the monoamine oxidase inhibitor,
Yes, yeah.
and then also the serotonin 1B receptor mutations were found in an extended family from Finland who had a strong history of criminal behavior, and they all had these stop mutation in the serotonin 1B receptor.
Wow.
So there are a couple of examples, but then our finding with SH2B1 is also a very clear-cut example, and it implicates brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, in aggressive behavior, which is clearly evident also in the mice. It appears to be like a reactive aggression.
Yeah.
So in mice and likely in people, it's your abnormal response to a threat.
Yeah.
And that's probably why we have this pathway. It does challenge how we think about criminal behavior, aggressive behavior. I think that's also why our particular paper, it took us 13 attempts to get it published.
Is that right? Gosh. That's
More than
appalling.
any other paper,
That's
because it
terrible.
was being turned down by many journals.
Where
because
was
they
it
were
published in the end, so I can
FASEB-J.
Really? Gosh.
And that's because actually many journals did not want to publish it. Now I think that's worrying, because
That's
actually
extremely
science is
worrying.
about
I agree.
communication and judge the quality of the work and critique it adequately and how it's written, but not a failure to publish just because you don't like the findings.
I couldn't agree more. Well, it was a wonderful presentation. Yeah. So maybe my last question, at a population level, taking in your work and work of others, if you had to sort of put a sort of, a number on the percentage influence on BMI of nature versus nurture at a population level, what would it be?
So we actually have good data on that. So from heritability studies, 40 to 70% of the variation in body mass index is due to genetic factors.
40 to 70%.
So it's pretty high, actually.
Why so wide?
Based on the studies, I think most of it's at least 40%,
Okay.
and it can be up to 70%.
Yeah. So if I said at least, roughly half
Yeah,
of the variability is
absolutely.
due to genetics,
Yeah.
I would be right.
Yeah, that's right.
Incredible.
Quite incredible.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Great.
I love the work coming from you,
Great,
Steve,
fantastic.
and others.
No,
Yeah, it's-
absolutely, and very excited about your work. And I think that looking at air pollution and factors in our environment, which will include diet, and how they increase the risk of many cancers is, I think, a huge field that really needs to be explored.
Oh, I
because
hope
we
so.
clearly are
Yeah.
seeing a rise in the prevalence of many cancers and cancers in younger
yeah,
people.
I agree.
Which
I
is
think
really concerning.
What we're sort of struggling with biologically is, if you take a risk factor like smoking, I briefly mentioned this in my talk, it's associated with a 30-fold increased risk of cancer. Relatively easy to study, a biological system in the lab in animal models and what have you. A lot of the remaining cancer risk factors, obesity, lack of
Yes.
exercise, red meat,
Yep.
air pollution, you name it, that they're associated with much more modest
Yes.
relative risks,
Yeah.
where you're increasing risk by maybe 50%, with air pollution. It's even less than that with obesity or exercise, lack of exercise, or red meat, for example. So how do you study these low relative risks in plausible biological systems that give you insights into mechanism
Yeah.
and ways in which one could think about drugging the pathway that you discover at a population level? And I think that's the problem we're dealing with
Yeah.
now. And in a sense, that's why I'm quite taken by this idea of thinking about it all in the context of aging, where there's sort of central inflammatory signals that aren't just driving one disease and disease
Yeah.
pathology associated with aging, but multiple different
Yeah.
disease pathologies associated with aging.
We should think about obesity too, because
Yeah.
actually, obesity, I think, in a way, is almost an accelerated form of aging.
I think that's right. Yeah, and they call it. They actually people relate to inflammaging.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so I think obesity similarly is likely to be associated with a number of cancers for that reason.
Yeah.
There'll probably be some specific mechanisms that drive particular cancers.
Yeah.
Some of the hormone-driven cancers, for example.
Yes. Yes.
But actually, obesity is associated with so many different types of cancer, almost all but 3 cancers, that actually there are clearly fundamental mechanisms that are changed.
Without a doubt, yeah.
I think you should study that.
No, I would like to study that. I really would. I've been thinking about it for some time, actually.
Maybe we should study that.
Talk. Okay. Well, maybe we could help you with some of the ongoing air pollution work we've got, because we're doing a lot of these experiments, and if you need blood from our animal models and what have you,
we
should
think about that.
Or other aspects of their anatomy, we'd be delighted to help.
Fantastic. Well, for me as a clinician scientist, it's trying to solve the problems of my patients is the main driver of my research. So, I'm concerned about the problems associated with obesity. I want to understand how the system works so that we can use that knowledge to improve the lives of patients. So it's the major driver of my research and what we seek to do.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same. So, for years, treating lung cancer, patients would come with never smoking lung cancer, to give you an example, our most recent interest, and they would be very similar, often women in their 50s, 60s, who would have had very healthy lifestyles, wouldn't have smoked, obviously. Some would be vegetarian, others would go to the gym, and they'd all ask the same question, which is, I've had an amazing lifestyle. I've never, I don't drink much. I eat well. I'm not overweight. I have never smoked. Why have I got lung cancer, doctor? And we never really had a good answer. I used to say, well, there are lots of risk factors associated with this disease, but we don't understand how or why this happens. And so we thought we would study the most important, which is most important. I say the most important, the one that had the greatest epidemiological data associated with it. We developed the model systems to be able to understand it in a little bit more detail. But it's absolutely all driven from the patient problem and the challenge we're facing. We took on lung cancer for the simple reason nobody else was interested in lung cancer back in 2010, 2011 when I started. And obviously lung cancer is the commonest cause of cancer death in the UK, and responsible for about 45,000 deaths a year in the United Kingdom. And the drugs don't work very effectively, and we need to understand more about how it starts, how it evolves, how it develops drug resistance, how we can develop new targets and new drugs to arrest its growth, essentially.
One of the unexpected impacts of our research has been we can use the better scientific knowledge to try to address the stigma that is faced by people with obesity. Certainly when I started my research about 25 years ago, people were astonished, why should I want to study obesity? It wasn't at all thought to be an interesting or even important condition at the time. Clearly it transpired that it was becoming an increasingly important condition. But we can use the science to tackle both the population, the healthcare professionals, and indeed the policymakers and their attitudes towards obesity. I'm very pleased that actually the attitudes of the next generation are clearly changing. So we're getting, I think the students of today don't have those same kind of attitudes, and I think they're already understanding and appreciating that this is an area that's worthy of scientific study and that's going to be important for the health of the nation and in fact globally. So I'm pleased that the tide is changing. I think there's still quite a lot of work to do, but I think it's also part of the job of researchers as well as clinicians who work in the field to tackle that stigma.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, similarly, when I first started in the lung cancer field 15 years ago, there was this pervasive view globally. Why would we invest in lung cancer research when it's all due to smoking? We just need to stop people smoking. That was the view. Cancer Research UK helped to change that, actually, and started this program to fund cancers of unmet need, lung cancer being one of them. And I think, you know, this whole issue of stigma that you raise is very important to tackle. And patients have said to me, and advocacy groups have said to me, that, you know, stigma is actually a medical construct. It's medics that perpetuate this stigma. So I think we all have a role to play here in tackling this disease and reducing the stigma, and obviously doing our best to advocate for tobacco control, but also to understand the underlying basis of the disease so that one can come up with better therapies to limit it and improve survival. I mean, it's crucial. I think it's really interesting to see how public communication has changed in the last sort of 20 years. You know, the funders, you know, 10, 15 years ago weren't particularly interested in public communication. Now all of the funders welcome MRC, Cancer Research UK. It's very central to everything we do. So at the Crick, for instance, we have, you know, public lectures. We have, I mean, last Friday we had a public podcast that 400 people were invited to, 400 lay people, hosted by Brian Cox. And there's huge interest, there's a huge appetite for science in the lay community. The problem has been our ability as scientists, I think, both willingness and ability to communicate. And it's communicating science is difficult. And you to some extent need training. It doesn't come naturally to everybody. But without a doubt, we depend upon the public to fund the work we do. And it's our duty to explain to them how we're spending, you know, to quote an American phrase, their tax dollars. We absolutely have to justify our existence. And also, as you've seen from the, you know, SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and what have you, you know, the role of scientists is crucially important. And without a doubt, there were mistakes made throughout that pandemic amongst from the scientific community. I think if there is ever another pandemic, we need to learn from. And much of those mistakes are around communication and actually communicating what science is. You know, science isn't, you know, if you're asked a question, you give a black and white answer. Science is an evolving process where knowledge is built through experimentation and evidence. And I think there's a sort of public perception, probably portrayed by us and the politicians, that, you know, we can give a definitive answer to a difficult scientific question, or there is a definitive answer. But, you know, those answers may change and adapt over time as evidence emerges. And it's our duty to explain the complexities of science to the public so that they can understand that uncertainty and help manage it. And I think that particularly during the COVID pandemic caused, you know, a lot of disquiet.
But it's also more important than ever before. So not only in terms of how we're spending the money that we're, you know, given from funders and from other groups and charities, but actually because there's disinformation around.
Without a doubt.
And so one of the key lessons I learned early on when challenged to go on television and talk about our research was actually, if you don't go out there and do it, somebody else will.
Yeah.
And that somebody else will likely be less well informed and know less than you.
Yeah.
And so then I realized that actually we have a responsibility to go out and communicate our science, to educate people not just about a particular area, such as obesity and areas around my own research, but actually, as you said, about how science works.
Yeah.
And when you do that, actually people, you know, will take things on board. But actually, if we don't, we leave a vacuum that is then filled nowadays by a lot of disinformation or fake information.
Yeah, you're right.
And that's also the challenge for us, is that we have to go on the front foot, if you like. We have to take that on. And we have to challenge that misinformation, because that misinformation is already having adverse effects on health, whether it's people with different types of cancer consuming diets that they think or are told by others are the right diet for someone with a certain type of cancer, for which there's no evidence whatsoever, not taking therapies that they're advised to take based on, you know, with no foundation. So there are a lot of challenges, and it's constantly moving and evolving, and we've got to kind of rise to that challenge, actually.
Amazing. Yeah, totally agree.